Yeah, Rabia, please start.
Okay, so I welcome you all on behalf of Department of Economics, School of Economics and Social Sciences, IBA Karachi, to another session of Economics Research Seminar Series. Today we have yet another great scholar with us, Dr. Sultan Mehmood. Dr. Sultan Mehmood is currently an assistant professor of economics at the New Economics School in Moscow. He holds a master's degree in economics from Tilburg University and MPhil degree in public policy and development from Paris School of Economics. He received his PhD degree from University of Paris in 2019, after which he worked as a postdoctoral researcher at Aix-Marseille School of Economics in Marseille and Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. Among his research interests are development economics, political economy, and law and economics. Dr. Mahmood is trying to answer questions why some countries are rich, why others are poor, and why some countries have dictatorships while others have democracies. In particular, he studies the conditions necessary for establishing the rule of law in different societies and the consequences of this on institutional design and development. Quite a large part of his research is about how the judge's appointment procedure affects the independence of the judicial system, the quality of justice, and economic development. His research on judicial independence and development for Pakistan was recognized by the European Academy of Institutional Economics as the best research conducted in 2018. So we are really fortunate today to have him at IBA. So before moving towards Dr. Sultan Mahmood, the format of the program of today's session will be the same. We will have 20 to 30 minutes of presentation. Then I'll open the floor for question and answers, and you can use the raise hand option if you have any questions after the presentation. So without any further delay, I present Dr. Sultan Mahmood.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be presenting here at IBA. I would much have rather liked to be there in person. But yes, we can make the best out of this. I particularly thanked Dr. Adnan for organizing this and for inviting me. And I'm very happy to be here and share my thoughts. Yeah, so also everybody can just call me Sultan, and if anybody will have questions, they can jump right in. I don't mind questions in the middle, I don't mind questions in the end, so I'm fine either way. Yeah, so thank you everybody. So now this paper is entitled Religious Leaders and Rule of Law, and this is joint work with my longtime co-author Evner, who's based in Aix-Marseille. Now, the motivation for this paper is rooted in history, where we have historical accounts. They are full of instances where we observe religious leaders to affect future trajectories of societies. If we begin, let's start from the West. You had Pope Urban II in 11th century France, who famously motivated all the soldiers to organize and launch the crusades against the Muslims, which many believe had profound consequences on development and institutions in the West. From the East, we have Imam al-Ghazali in 12th century Persia, who many people believe also had profound influence on Muslim societies. For example, his famous fatwa against mathematics, many believe had a lot of negative consequences on Muslim societies and Muslim technological growth, which was very high at that time. Now, at least in Enlightenment, we have scholars who have argued that religious leaders in politics and institutions have adverse impact on society and economic development at large, and more especially Spinoza. Now, more recently, scholars, especially Jared Rubin and Jean-Philippe Plateau, have begun to disentangle that how do religious authorities impact politics in general and institutions. Now, despite these admirable efforts, we lack systematic empirical evidence on how do religious leaders impact institutions. In particular, how do religious leaders influence courts and rule of law? Now, this paper tries to answer these questions. And to answer these questions, it asks a preceding question. First of all, how do historical religious institutions impact rule of law? Or alternatively, how do religious institutions impact legal institutions? And whether the effect of these religious institutions can be traced back to the rise of religious leaders to political power. I answered these questions utilizing data from Pakistan. And to give you more context, I want to show you this, one of my favorite shrines, the Bahauddin Zakaria Shrine in the city of Multan. As you would know, this shrine is the Gaddi Nashin or the Sajada Nashin of this shrine is none other than Makhdum Shah Mahmud Qureshi, which, as you know, is a prominent politician and the current foreign minister of Pakistan. Now, the question which I pose is, what happens when people like Shah Mahmud Qureshi, who are not just politicians, but also these Gaddi Nashins, rise to power? When these people rise to power, they might have different voter base, and this voter base might allow them to do much more than which different religious leaders would get to power. So for a comparison, what we are seeking is, we are comparing not two great politicians, but for example, what happens to institutions and judiciary in particular when Shah Mahmud Qureshi rises to power versus when Jahangir Khan Tareen rises to power. Both are rich, large landowning politicians, very powerful, but one is slightly different in the fact that one is a Gaddi Nashin and the other is not. So now the argument of my paper and the geopolitical equilibrium I see my model in is as follows. Now, throughout Pakistan's political history, local politics has been dominated by large landowning feudal politicians. They alternate power at the local level and the provincial level, whereas at the federal level, the military yields the largest power. Now, from time to time, we see the military intervening and directly coming to power. For example, in 1999, General Musharraf introduced the military coup and became in charge of the helm of affairs. Now, whenever military leaders come, they disrupt the balance of power of traditional elites. And they bring to power these shrine leaders. For example, Shah Mahmud Qureshi joined politics after military coup of General Zia. So every time the military leaders introduce this local government system, which is supposed to be on the surface looks very good. It's going to, like Musharraf said, I'm going to introduce the essence of democracy, but this may have effect on rule of law. What I argue is that when these religious leaders come to power, the Sajada Nashins or the Gaddi Nashins, they are a bit different from regular politicians. They derive their legitimacy from religion. They say that locals believe around them, like the followers of Shah, murids of Shah Mahmud Qureshi, that he's the direct descendant of Prophet Muhammad of Islam. So he can do no wrong. And he does not need to perform as much as other leaders. So what my theoretical argument is that these religious leaders enjoy higher legitimacy among the public and hence face smaller electoral costs of deteriorating rule of law, influencing judges than relatively secular leaders. Now, the theoretical framework I have is a game theoretic model with several players. You have the voters maximizing their utility. For example, voters in shrine density districts prefer to vote for politicians with religious credentials or legitimacy. So the voters around Shah Mahmud Qureshi would like to vote for people like Shah Mahmud Qureshi, who also are Gaddi Nashins. You have then the politicians, where in my model, they're heterogeneous politicians instead of other models where all politicians are alike. In our model, we have secular and religious politicians which compete in elections and decide whether or not to run for office. And then in addition to voters and politicians, we also have the judges, where judges decide to rule on cases based on two factors. One is their own integrity, and second is the influence, the political influence that is acted on them. So these three players combine, we solve the Nash equilibrium of these three players and derive the endogenous structure of the political competition. Coming to the empirics, what I show is that districts with high historical shrine density have worse rule of law. These have more pro-government rulings and lower quality judicial decisions. And this, I show, is entirely explained by the rise of religious leaders to political power. So the effect of historical shrine density is explained by the shrine leaders becoming politicians and holding executive office. Now, my identification to get causal effects comes from this unanticipated military coup, where suddenly in 1999, General Musharraf came to power, imprisoned the prime minister, and had this. So this was an exogenous shock to the system, which suddenly brought a lot of shrine leaders to political office. And we compare rule of law outcomes or judicial outcomes before and after the military coup across Pakistani districts with predetermined high versus low shrine density. What we estimate is that religious leaders can expropriate larger, so religious leaders influence the courts to expropriate additional land worth 0.06% of GDP or 180 million US dollars every year. So basically, these religious leaders are better at qabzas than non-religious leaders. That is not to say that non-religious leaders are great. It's just a comparison that compared to non-religious leaders, so compared to Jahangir Tareen, for example, or Jahangir Tareen, Shah Mahmud Qureshi would be able to expropriate more and influence the courts more because in addition to wealth, he also has the gaddi. And this amount which they expropriate, which is 180 million US dollars per year, is not a small amount. This is equivalent to the entire federal budget for healthcare, which the government of Pakistan allocated in 2016. Now, this paper speaks to several strands of economic literature, political science literature, as well as social psychology literature. So, for example, it speaks to this literature on dynasties and political dynasty and leaders per se. It also speaks to this literature of Acemoglu and Robinson in particular, where they ask, what are the conditions for establishment of rule of law in society? We provide one such conditions to have what kind of leaders elected. Third, it also speaks to this vibrant literature on political economy of religion, especially how religion diffuses into politics. Fourth, I also speak to the literature on long-term consequences of culture and institutions on political and economic development. Now, I contribute to this literature in four ways. First, I show that like economic development, which Nathan Nunn has shown, has deep roots, rule of law and judicial decisions also have deep roots. The shrines which continue to affect us today were made in 12th century, in 13th century, but they continue to exert an effect, implying that what happened in the past continues to haunt us even today. Second, I contribute to this literature by showing how exactly do religious institutions shape legal institutions, and in particular, by bringing religious leaders to political helm. Finally, we focus on Pakistan, which is a large developing country. It is the fifth most populous country now. It is a context where very few studies take place, empirical studies, where democratic institutions have not really taken root and studies are lacking. Now, this is how I have organized the rest of the presentation. I will present you some information on the data I use, the empirical methodology I use, my identification strategy and threats to identification and how I overcome them, followed by the main results and the estimated equations, followed by the mechanisms driving the results and conclusion. Now, what I won't do is go through the hundreds of robustness checks I did to show the stability of my estimates. But if you will have questions on them, I have them in the appendix of this study as well. Now, what is the data? Where does the data come from? So one of the key challenges of doing a study like this in Pakistan is, of course, the data constraints, where it is very difficult to basically get access to fine-grained micro-level data. So we rely on primary data collection, and we collect data, and our primary outcome variable or rule of law outcome variables or dependent variables are constructed from the texts of judgment orders. These are decisions written down by judges regarding different cases. Now, I combine this judgment text with data on shrines, which I obtain from the British colonial gazettes. So British colonial gazettes have shrine data sets across different districts of Pakistan, where they have a section on all the shrines listed. In addition, we also cross-check our results with data on shrines from the Awqaf department in the Ministry of Religious Affairs. We also combine this data with election data for election with the Election Commission of Pakistan, where basically we match the honorific title of shrine leaders. We distinguish in the election data, Election Commission of Pakistan data, whether you are a Makhdoom or whether you're not a Makhdoom, using the name as an identifier for a shrine leader. So, yeah, just 1 second. Yeah, so basically, in addition to election data, where we basically combine the shrine leaders' honorific titles, we also use the census records, in particular the agriculture census and the population census, to get information on district characteristics. Now, this might seem a bit vague, so I just wanted to show you the data, an example of a data point. So this is a case in the High Court of Karachi, where a case is filed against by Khalid Mohsin against the Ministry of Defense or Government of Pakistan, against the state. Where the petition says that his home has been captured, or like he's owner of a land, and what the judge has ruled is the petition is dismissed. The government will retain custody of the house. Now, in addition to this judgment data, these are the British colonial gazette. So every gazette of a district. So for example, this is the Mianwali District Gazette, which has shrines in Mianwali. This is the Sialkot District Gazette, which has shrines in Sialkot, Rawalpindi, and so forth. So this is how our data looks like. So what we do is we randomly sample 7,500 cases from 1986 to 2016. This is about 0.2% of population of all cases decided in this time period. And about 500 judges are deciding these cases, who are spread across the 16 district benches or divisional benches of Pakistan. So if we want to see the judicial jurisdictions and a shrine density there, we see this is how it looks like. Now, how do we measure rule of law? We focus on all the cases where the citizen is poised against the state. And the key outcome variable we construct is state wins, which takes the value of 1, the government obtains a victory, and 0 if the citizen obtains a victory. Now, the state here is the local government, the provincial government, and also the federal government. Now, these are the instances where elected politicians have the highest stakes to influence courts, especially when the case is against them in particular. Also, this definition of the state is exactly according to the conceptualization of the state as an executive organ in Montesquieu. Now, state wins variable is measured in 2 ways. First, we ask a law firm to code the state victory variable as 1 and state defeats variable as 0. Now, this may be subjective. So what we do is we do a textual analysis of the judgments and try to create objective measures of state. So we look through a Python dictionary, for example, on whether the text of the judgment order contains the text petition against the state is dismissed, in which case state victory variable will take the value of 1. And if the text of the judgment order contains the marker petition against the state is accepted, state victory variable will take the value of 0. Now, in addition to state wins, we have other variables, especially case delay, which is also a very objective measure of judicial efficiency. So for example, it is the time it takes for the case to be decided from the case when it is first filed. In addition, we also have whether the decisions are on merits of the case or on evidence of the case relative to a legal lacuna or technicality. Many legal scholars in Pakistan argue that the way government is favored in Pakistan is judges not deciding on the facts of the case, rather delaying cases on legal technicalities or lacunas. Now, so what is our empirical methodology? It's fairly straightforward. It is a difference in differences estimate, where on the left-hand side, you have the state victory variable. On the right-hand side, you have the interaction of military coup with historical shrine density. Now, in addition, we add district fixed effects, time fixed effects, and even case type fixed effects, and a long list of case characteristics, judge characteristics, and district characteristics and as controls. Now, kappa is our difference and differences estimate for the impact of shrine density on state victories following the coup. Now, to estimate kappa and derive causal effects, we have to think a bit. We have to think about identification. What are we assuming here? We are basically exploiting the timing of the military coup and using the fact that military coup was unexpected and unanticipated, the exact timing, and was hence unrelated to the specific dynamics which these district courts were following. However, there are some identifying assumptions which we should be very careful of, on which difference and differences methodology rests on. So difference and differences methodology basically rests on 2 key identification assumptions. First, the famous prior trends or parallel trends assumption, where it is saying that there are no systematic differences in trends of state wins among high versus low shrine density districts before and after the reform. Second, an often ignored assumption of difference and differences is no time invariant heterogeneity assumption, where you are assuming implicitly that there are no time invariant unobserved factors that coincide temporally with military coup and differentially affect rule of law. Now, we provide evidence in favor of both of these assumptions, which increases our confidence in the causal interpretation of these results. So just as a first pass, the parallel trends assumption, we can check this a bit informally first by, for example, showing a rough plot of our data. So these are state wins over time. And what do we observe? We observe that over time, before the reform, districts that had no shrines and districts that had at least one shrines are seem to follow a common trend before the military coup. However, immediately at the time of the military coup, districts that have shrines suddenly jumps and their state wins increases. So our difference and differences estimate is basically making a comparison against this. This is our treatment group, and this is our control group, which has no shrines before and after the coup. However, this is a simple uh, raw eyeballing test. You have to really rule out prior trends assumption or parallel trends. You have to do more sophisticated examination. And this is what I do here, is where basically we show relative to a baseline that districts that had more shrines had no effect on state victories before the military coup, when there was no military religious leaders rising to power, but only when the religious leaders rose to power, you see an effect on states. Now, what is the second assumption? The second assumption, identifying assumption, is that there are no confounding interactions with the coup. So there are not other things changing with the coup. It can, a plausible case can be made that different types of cases are filed before and after the coup. But for this to cause a problem for the identification, you need this to be strategically correlated with high shrine density districts. So cases needs to fall in proportion to districts that have high shrines. And what we show here is this is not the case, where you have almost a precisely estimated zero effect, where the case characteristics and the judge characteristics do not change. We can do even more rigorous test by adding the confounding interactions one by one, where we show that our coefficients are incredibly stable even when we basically interact our long list of case characteristics, judge characteristics, or district characteristics in a regression. Now, coming to the main results. When we want to estimate kappa, what we find is that a one standard deviation increase in shrine density increases state wins by about 5 percentage points. Because the shrine density is about 0.005%, when you multiply this number with this, you get an estimate of 5 percentage points. So one standard deviation increase in shrine density is basically increasing state wins by about 10% over the mean of the dependent variable, which is a substantial effect. In addition, we find case quality falls. It's not just state wins is increasing, the quality of judicial decisions are also deteriorating. Rule of law is being hurt. For example, immediately after the military coup, we see case delay increases. So for example, this estimate suggests that if you go in a district in Pakistan where there is high shrine density area, for example, if you go to Multan, cases will take about 6 months longer than in Lahore, where there are relatively less shrines, immediately after the coup. So for example, if you went to a court and filed a case in Multan on December 1999, not in October, you would basically, you would have, your case delay would be longer in Multan relative to Lahore. So case delay increases. Now, some people have argued that case delay is not a really great measure of judicial efficiency. And they argue that if case delay increases, it might be due to greater deliberation on cases. So judges are basically thinking very carefully. That's why you have higher case delay. We all know in Pakistan, this is unlikely because especially the case delays of 20 years, how long do you need to think, right? For example, the average case delay is about 3.33 years. Sometimes cases take 20 years, sometimes cases take 1 year. So the average is pretty long. So if you file a case, on average, you should expect a decision in at least 3 years. And these are the high courts where things are much better than in the lower courts. Now, to answer this question, whether increased case delay is a bad thing, I also provide additional evidence where I show that not only increased shrine density deteriorates uh, uh, case delay by increasing case delay, at the same time, we see high shrine density areas to have lesser rulings on merits of the case. So what will happen, again, if I go to my Multan example, if you go file a case in Multan in November 1999, you are less likely to get a decision on merits than if you filed a case in Lahore where there are less shrines. So taking together the results on higher state wins, higher case delay, and lower decision on evidence or merits of the case suggest that after the military coup combined with historical religious institutions deteriorated rule of law. Now, what are the mechanisms driving the results? So why exactly are these shrines, which was built in 12th century, 13th century, Mughal emperors used to go and donate to the shrines. The British came and they were basically giving money to the shrine leaders. How do these shrines, which were made so long ago, is affecting courts today? And the answer to this question is that this effect is explained by the rise of religious leaders to political power. Second question we ask is, how do religious leaders impact the courts? What are they doing exactly? Third, we ask, what are the types of cases driving the results? So what are these religious leaders win cases in? So what are those cases? And finally, we even go deeper into the mechanism and try to explain that why do religious leaders want to influence the courts relative to secular leaders? Now, if we just do a simple comparison of number of shrine elites elected from office from Election Commission of Pakistan data set, we observe an interesting pattern. What we are seeing is that the number of shrine elites are fairly constant before the military coup. And immediately after the military coup, you see a sudden and permanent jump, which lasts even after the military rule has ended. Why this is interesting is that the consequence of military rule lasts even when you leave, even when the direct authoritarian leadership leaves. So what is this showing? It is showing that basically a lot of religious leaders rose to power and they stayed in power even after the military coup. Think of General Zia. He brought to power Shah Mahmud Qureshi. He became a mayor of Multan first, and then he became an MPA and then MNA, and even right now you still have him in the system. Now, coming to the question of, so this is all suggestive. It's not concrete causal evidence. To really provide causal evidence, you have to look at more fine grain analysis. And what we do here is we do a triple differences, where we have a triple interaction term, where we interact our shrine density variable with number of shrine elites elected into post-coup dummy. So these are districts where there are more shrines, where there are more shrine elites elected after the coup. And what we find is that the effect is entirely explained by the districts where shrine leaders won elections. So for example, if a shrine leader won elections, it had effect on courts in those high shrine density districts. But in these high shrine density districts where shrine leaders did not win elections, you have a statistically insignificant results. Meaning that it's not just magic of shrines which is determining the results. It is actually people in the shrines running elections and winning elections, which increases state wins on that local court. In addition, we can directly look in the court data set that not just the state, whether the cases which directly involve the shrine leaders are positively impacted. And we find that as well, where high shrine density areas where the shrine leaders are elected, the shrine leader is more likely to win the case himself. Now, finally, I want to go to this out transfers. The question is how, yeah, I will go here, yeah. So now the question is, how do religious leaders or shrine leaders impact the courts? So what are they doing? You know, we know they are not killing judges, for example. What are they doing? So now to do this, we take the cue from work done by Sadiq in his book, The Alien Justice, where he suggests that religious leaders in Pakistan influence the courts through an actual or threat of a transfer to a reassignment of district. So a religious leader or a religious politician basically influences the Chief Justice to transfer the judges to a different district. And why can they do it and not face electoral backlash? Because they face smaller electoral costs of transferring judges relative to what a secular leader uh, would, uh, would face. Now, this is also consistent with recent evidence where politicians are able to control the behavior of bureaucrats by reassigning them to posts of varying importance. Especially the paper of Anandi Mani and Lakshmi A.R. is important, where she shows that Indian politicians, although they cannot fire the bureaucrats, it's much like in Pakistan, but they can also do transfers and posting. And this basically is a way that politicians use to control the bureaucrats' behavior. So what we see is that judges in high shrine density areas, precisely where shrine leaders are elected, have higher out transfers. So they are sent to different districts more often than in low shrine density areas. So for example, when one more judge for one standard deviation increase in shrine density increases the transfers by about 2.33% over the sample mean. Now, this is alternative explanations. I won't alternative specification. I won't go into too much detail, but instead of a difference in differences, we can also do two-stage least squares and estimate the effect of shrine elite directly, where here we can see that when one more shrine leaders rise to power, state victories increases by about 1 percentage points. Now, another thing is interesting here. So now I just presented you state wins as a whole, but we can actually break down the state into its component parts: the local government cases, the federal government cases, and the provincial government cases. So what here we see is that these high shrine density areas are not influencing cases at the federal level. They are not, these local politicians are unable to influence the courts as much. For example, they cannot influence the Supreme Court. Most of the disputes with the federal government is in the Supreme Court. But what they do influence are the local courts involving the local government. So what is interesting is that when, for example, the military comes in, it is not basically just helping itself and consolidating its power, and it's not interfering in courts as much. It's like these local leaders who the military brings which cause the damage. So that's also an additional implication of this research. So how the patronage which is given to certain religious politicians influence institutions. Finally, what type of cases are driving the results? These are cases involving land expropriation, so home expropriation, kabzas, and political rights, where political rights are cases when the state is poised against a citizen in political rights, their political rights are basically expropriated. So I won't, yeah, this is one article which is also consistent with this. This is also, finally, we dig even deeper into the mechanism and try to understand why can religious leader influence the courts? How exactly are religious leaders influencing courts, the shrine leaders? Now, historians, we are doing an empirical analysis, but we have to learn from history. And historians have basically two broad views of how religious leaders influence politics and institutions. First, you have the Colson view, or like I would like to call like this really phenomenal Pakistani historian K.K. Aziz, which not many people unfortunately know. His great work on Piri Muridi is something which I have really learned from. So they have these two views. So the Aziz view, or the K.K. Aziz view, is that the religious leaders coerce through their wealth and large landholding. So what basically they are saying, like Gil Martin, Colson, etc., these are saying that religious leaders are not much different. It's just that they have the donations coming from the Qadi, they have a lot of money, they have a lot of influence, and they wield their influence through these large land ownings. So they are also kind of feudals. But recently, new work by Jared Rubin and Jean-Philippe Plateau has basically argued, again, using historical data, including Pakistan, where they say that religious leaders have wealth, but at the same time, they have this additional superpower, which is this legitimacy and hold over the people, which allows them to get away with more stuff than a relative secular leader can. A secular leader cannot say it's God's will if he is performing badly, but a religious leaders can sometimes get away. Now, to do this, to provide an explicit test of this, we actually use data from the Ministry of Agriculture. And we look at all politician agriculturalists who are not shrine leaders, who are these large landowners, they all cotton fields in particular, but also sugar cane, sugar mills. And what we see is that in high shrine density areas, when these large landowners win elections, you have no effect. So it's not like the shrines are related to just wealth and power. These shrines are related to the religious leaders, and only when religious leaders win elections, you see an effect. When just wealthy, large landowning politicians, the cotton barons win elections, or the sugar barons win election, you see no effect. So coming close to the conclusion, but what I have shown is districts with higher historical shrine density have higher state wings, longer case delays, and lesser decisions on evidence. And the empirical evidence suggests that these results are entirely explained by the rise of religious leaders to political power. We find no effect in districts, in shrine districts where shrine leaders did not win elections. We find no effect in cases that are not politically salient. For example, we find an effect in land expropriation and human rights cases, but we find no effect in cases involving theft, burglary, vandalism, minor fraud. Here, religious leaders do not have an incentive to influence the courts. And interestingly, we find the largest effect in cases which directly involve the religious leaders. We also calculate the economic value of additional land that was expropriated by religious leaders, which is in the value of about 180 million US dollars per year. Like I said in the beginning, this is about the entire healthcare budget, which the federal government of Pakistan had earmarked in the year 2016. So I would just leave you with this final quotation from K.K. Aziz's book, An Investigation into Piri Muridi, a case study of Pakistan, where he concludes one of his chapters by saying about shrine leaders that they came with religion but no land, and left with land but no religion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such an interesting and engaging presentation, I must say. So I can see a few raised hands. So Dr. Kesser, please, if you want to ask the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, Rabia, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello.
Yeah, Dr. Sultan. Yeah, thank you very much. It is a wonderful presentation. I just want to clarify one thing from you. You said there is exogenous shocks was in 1999 when the President Musharraf was. After that, then you divided your sample before 99 and after 99. I think this was already started from the Zia era. What do you think? Why not you include Zia era actually? I think at that time, this most of these religious people, not religious, shrine people, enter the politics, which I understand it. One thing. And one more question is, I think only when you talk about Shah Mahmud Qureshi, what about the Sindh actually? If we notice it, there are a lot of shrines in Sindh. Is there no data availability? That's why you did not cover it, or you covered it? Maybe I missed it that one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kasser, for these really, really important questions. So firstly, I guess your hunch is right. So the reason why we focused on 1992 is because there is data for judicial decisions from 1986. But how we think about it is that our results is that basically an underestimation. If we look at Zia, we will get even larger effects. So even in Ayub Khan, I would expect some effects, but maybe less than Zia, because Ayub Khan also introduced this basic democracy and local governments. So basically, as you notice, how I see it is that after every military coup, every authoritarian leader who comes to power, he introduces this local government system. And why is he doing it? An explanation I give in this paper, he's doing it so people who are not these feudals, but they are these religious leaders can come to power, legitimize his rule. Again, also I have a theoretical paper where I try to answer this more carefully by basically showing that the military free rides on the legitimacy of the shrine leaders. By becoming associated with Shah Mahmud Qureshi, it gains support of the public, especially the public which follows him. This is one question. Secondly, you are right. So Sindh is in my data set, and actually we find larger effect for Sindh. And as exactly you predicted, maybe I should put it in the paper in more prominently and argue for that as well. And the reason for this is, like you suggest, is because there are much more shrine leaders in Sindh as well. Yeah. Thank you for this question.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Mohammed Nadeem Server. Yes, please go ahead with your question.
Assalamu alaikum. Rabia, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sultan, for the wonderful presentation. Actually, what was interesting for me as a PhD student in economics, that we can think about non-conventional topics like the one you did. It's not mostly touched upon. However, I have some questions like, we also have so many judges from Gaddi-Nashin family or from the family that is closely associated with some Gaddi-Nashin, Peer Saab ho gaye unke, and they influence the hiring of those judges. And in reward, those judges may decide the cases in their favor. So how to control for that? One thing. And second, how about checking it on religious leaders that are not Gaddi-Nashi? Like if you allow me to name Mr. Fazlur Rahman. He's not a Gaddi-Nashi, but he is a big religious leader. How about testing it on those leaders as well? Thank you.
So first of all, that's a great question. First of all, and also second of all, you can just call me Sultan. Thirdly, that's so how I think about it is it's easier from data to identify a shrine leader from non-shrine leaders because they are in the election nomination papers, they write their Gaddi-Nashin. For example, they write Makhdoom, their title. So Fazlur Rahman, when he writes his election papers, he only writes Fazlur Rahman, not Maulana Fazlur Rahman, which is, if he had written Maulana Fazlur Rahman, nobody writes it. I would have been able to check exactly what you say, but this is a fascinating question, which we unfortunately cannot answer. But the second question I think is very interesting as well. What about the network of judges who are Gaddi-Nashin? I think this is something which people, PhD students like you can pursue. I think this is a very interesting question where how there is. So for example, what would I expect? I would expect that judges who are Gaddi machines would affect or closely associated with Gaddi machines would have even larger state wins when shrine leaders win because they're in the network. But I'm just right now, what my result is showing is that just any judge on average, which may have Gaddi machines and which may not have Gaddi machine, on average has an effect. But if we want to do this, we will be able to see a heterogeneous effect where you will have a different effect when a Gaddi machine is not involved. Maybe it's a lesser effect on state wins, but when a Gaddi machine judge is involved, you might have an even higher state wins. So this is a heterogeneity which would be interesting to study.
Thank you. Yes, Saud, please, you can ask the next question.
Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. It really added to my knowledge. The question I had was like the phenomena you have discussed over here was that like how these shrine how these religious scholars, religious people associated with shrines have this effect, right? So like I was wondering if that phenomena is at the same time is it exclusive to these shrine related religious leaders, or is it like does it also include what do you call religious leaders who associate themselves with mosques and madrasas? So like, would that be inclusive of this as well? Or like, is it something completely separate over here?
So I think in empirical analysis, we should be very careful about the external validity. Although it's nice to say that my result is very general, but that wouldn't be fair for the interest of science. What I'm showing, the effect is only about shrine leaders. So this is the effect of shrine leaders. So because especially a Western audience would never understand what's a shrine leader or what is a Gaddi machine, I have framed it as religious leaders, just to have a broad term. But yeah, these are of course not religious scholars. Like they don't have a degree. Yusuf Raza Gilani, who's a shrine leader, Shah Mahmud Qureshi, who's a shrine leader, they don't have degrees in religion, right? So they're not scholars per se. They are so, and also they are not, so they're not imams. So here the results, what I'm showing you is of not some common imam in a madrasa, but it is a result where these Gaddi machines have an effect.
Thank you.
Also, I would expect that Gaddi machines affect, like, for example, land cases. However, these religious imams might affect some different types of cases. For example, whether a woman can divorce or not, they can khula, and these kind of things they would probably affect, which would be interesting investigation in itself.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another question? Yes, Yahya Shahid, please go ahead with the question. You can.
He is muted, that's why he cannot.
Yeah, so you can unmute yourself. Okay. Yes, now you
can you hear me?
Yes,
yes,
we can hear you.
We can hear you now.
Okay. Sir, my question is that as far as our country's ideology is concerned, totally it is based on Islamic ideology. How can we separate our democracy with religious beliefs and the culprits who are using name of religion? Meanwhile, practically our democracy as well as economy is suffering. And secondly, I would like to add another thing. The level of education in rural areas of Pakistan is creating more Islamic patrons, who in fact don't understand a single word from Quran. Who is responsible? Our education standard or our institutions? Who is responsible?
Yeah, so there are two things that in this question. So there are two kinds of economics. One is positive economics and one is normative economics. Your question is normative. What ought to be done? And my research is positive, how the world is. So I am just explaining what is happening. And it is up to the policymakers and people's IQ and activists to. So what I have shown is that what religious leaders have this influence on courts, and they, especially Gaddi machines going to power, can have this negative influence where case delays are increased, influence on judges are increased. Now that is up to the activists now, how they want to take this information. I would be completely neutral, But an activist can basically, they can organize themselves and say, well, this shouldn't happen, and they can lobby the government. They basically, yeah, work on like education in the rural areas about these Gadi machines and these kind of things. And so many things can be done by them, but that's not a position of a scholar. Yeah, so that is, my job is just to explain the world how it is, and it's up to students, activists, all these people uh, to think about these issues and discuss them.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other question? So I'm just curious, I have a little question here. Do we see such phenomena of state patronage happening from, in other countries around the world, or especially, I mean, I don't, building on the last question, I don't believe that it's more of the education thing, because we see a lot of educated people who actually follow these religious leaders. So like in India, we see this patronage from state of these political powers, political leaders. So is it relevant to other countries?
That's a great question. So yeah, I didn't touch upon this. The question, yeah. So I completely agree that it's not, so many people have this a bit slightly false belief, like you have alluded to, that the poor are the jahils and they don't know anything. But the poor don't know any religion. They are just making their ends meet. So they don't really know Quran, but at the same time, they don't hold many of the beliefs that many educated people believe, which, for example, comes from Arabization of different Pakistani culture, which are like a bit foreign to South Asia. So that is one thing which we should be careful for. Now, what kind of, so now, does it hold? There is no data for it, but a lot of historical accounts say, for example, that similar phenomena holds in Iran, where the imams are very similar. And also it holds in India as well. So shrines, Pakistan has the largest number of shrines in the world. The second largest is India, and third is Iran. So this study is speaking not just to Pakistan, it's speaking to all the countries which have shrines and which have gadis.
True.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So do we have any other question, or I think it's almost time. Thank you so much. I thank you on behalf of Chairperson, Department of Economics, Dr. Adnan Haider, as well as Dean, School of Economics and Social Science, Dr. Asma Haider. Thank you so much for such an insightful presentation. I really enjoyed it personally as well. And I think I am talking on behalf of all the participants. So thank you so much for your time and for agreeing to present for IBA.
It's
really.
My pleasure. I would like to thank again Dr. Adnan for inviting me, and Dr. Asma also for attending. I look forward to interact with them and the faculty and the students in the future, and hopefully I really want to visit IBA and also present it in person.
That would be great. I think Dr. Adnan wants to say something.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sultan. Great paper. I learned a lot from your empirical insights. Previously, I remember a very similar paper, but from different perspective. Dr. Adil Malik presented at University of Oxford. At that time, I was at Oxford. And right now, you actually remind me all those empirical insights presented by Dr. Adil Malik. And your paper also is a really value addition to that literature. Thank you so much for your presentation. Really, really fascinating paper.
Dr. Adnan, thank you so much. And Adil Malik's paper is very important. I cite it and discuss it in the full paper in detail. Actually, our data sources on shrines are exactly the same. So they show the effect of shrines on literacy. And here we are looking at the effect of shrines on rule of law. So yeah, I guess both complement each other. Both basically complement each other. I really like Rinchen Mirza and Adil Malik's paper on this pre-colonial institutions. And yeah, this is and that paper I've also learned from a lot. So yeah, thanks.
Look forward to work with you more on different projects, inshallah. Thank you so much.
Inshallah. Khuda Hafiz. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. See you in the next session.
Bye.